This series is not a tale of logic and reason. It is a descent into shadows, secrets, and the crimes that refuse to die. We will uncover the forgotten roots of crime fiction, haunted mansions, unreliable confessions, spectral witnesses, and guilty minds fractured by mirrors and blood. And through this, we will explore how fear, guilt, madness, and supernatural shaped the genre we believed we understood. This is the archive of the repressed. Welcome to Gothic Evidence Dark Inheritance, a world where justice limps behind secrets, where madness wears a velvet coat, and the blood on the floor tells stories older than law or even time. Welcome. You have returned to the criminal imagination. You see, this is not merely a tale of whodunits and clever deductions, nor of tidy courtrooms and final confessions. Here we move beneath the polished floors and into the crypt, through corridors not lined with clues, but with classified reports. What if the real crime scene is not the alley but the archive, not the dagger but the diary? And what if, just what if, the fingerprints we find belong not to murderers but to empires? Let's descend then into that cold bureaucratic tomb called the Colonial Archive. Let's pry it open with our ink-stained hand and see what please. Because sometimes documentation is the perfect guise for disappearance. There is something obscene about the neatness of the Colonial Archive. Too pristine, too official. Rows of logbooks, weathered expedition notes, trade records, court transcripts, plantation inventories. Each entry a brick in the edifice of empire. But beneath this illusion of order is a long haunted silence. What was written down was often a lie, and what was true was rarely written at all. And so we find ourselves not in a library, but in a crime scene. The chalk outline drawn around a missing testimony, the redacted name, the sealed confession, the voice that was never transcribed, and two texts: Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Salih and the Moor's account by Laila Lalami stand as spectral witnesses to this crime. Let me begin with Salih, a Sudanese writer trained in England. Salih knew the archive from both sides. He knew what it recorded and what it erased. In Season of Migration to the North, our unnamed narrator returns to his homeland after years of study abroad, only to find his village haunted by a stranger, Mustafa Saib, suave, educated, seductive, and utterly unknowable. A man who passed as civilized in London's drawing rooms until he left a trail of ruin through the women who adored him. But Mustafa is not simply a man. He is a fiction created by colonialism, fractured by exile, and bound together by the very documentation that tried to define him. He once tells the narrator, I have seen evil and I have seen the affliction of man by man. I am no Othello. Othello was a lie. A lie. Let that settle. Because the colonial archive is full of Othellos, tragic, exotic, doomed, paper dolls in a script they didn't write. Mustafa's life is littered with academic prizes, polished credentials, and sealed courtroom records. But these documents only obscure the truth. He is both celebrated and erased, seen but never known. A ghost flickering between registers, haunting both empire and host colony. Even his confession left behind in writing is untrustworthy. It is not a revelation, it's a trap, puzzle with no solution. His archive becomes a kind of curse. In a way, Salih shows us what happens when testimony becomes performance and the record becomes a noose. Now let us turn to Laila Lalami. The Moor's account does something extraordinary. It exhumes a voice from beneath centuries of imperial silence. Her protagonist, Estebanico, based on a real figure, is a Moroccan slave who joined the doomed Narvaez expedition to the New World in 1527. He is one of the four survivors, and yet, in every official Spanish record, his name is missing, erased, replaced with a vague and Arab slave. Lalami gives him back his voice. I am not a footnote, he says in silence over and over. What she creates is not just fiction, it is restoration, testimony, a counter narrative. Estebanico's story is not in the grand chronicles of conquest, but in his own words. He does not narrate battles, but the slow violence of being observed, controlled, owned. He recounts how his truth was stolen, rephrased by conquistadors, censored by scribes, twisted by power. And here lies the crime. The archive bears no wounds. It holds the appearance of truth, but beneath its polished Latin is the bone-deep silence of the enslaved, the colonized, the forgotten. Both texts, Salih's and Lalami's, force us to confront the illusion of objectivity. Let me put it more plainly. The colonial archive files. It lies in its omissions, in its classifications, in its translations. The record is not a mirror, it is a scalpel. It carves reality into parts that fit the empire's anatomy. In doing so, it mutilates the living and then it calls the wound history. And so in this series, we must read not as detectives but as resurrectionists. We must exhume, not explain. A motif that links these works is silence testimony. In both cases, the protagonist's voice is either distorted or unrecorded by official documents. In Salih's novel, Mustafa's narrative is buried under years of colonial education, psychiatric evaluation, and bureaucratic translation. Even his suicide, if we can call it that, is wrapped in riddles. The Nile becomes his coffin, but also his last defiance. His disappearance leaves no clear trace. In Lalami's novel, the archive contains only silence. Estebanico's name was scrubbed, his achievements, critical to the expedition's survival, credited to others. His body was documented, his mind was not. And so we ask, what kind of crime fiction is this where the crime is silence? What happens when the victim is not murdered but erased? False memory is the next ghost in our tale. Empire doesn't just take land, it takes memory. It rewrites the past so thoroughly that even those who lived through it begin to doubt themselves. Mustafa Saeed is the perfect case. He is a man built from other people's projections, fetishized by British women as the Oriental seducer, dehumanized by bureaucrats as the subject of study, and celebrated by Sudanese elites as a symbol of post-colonial triumph. But he is none of these things. His true self, if such a thing even remains, has been buried beneath so many masks that even he cannot retrieve it. He becomes a riddle wrapped in a murder trial, sealed in an academic transcript. Likewise, Estebanico knows that his memories are no longer his. He remembers speaking with indigenous communities in the New World. He remembers learning their languages, their customs. He remembers surviving. But the official accounts omit all this. Instead, they record only the Spaniards' bravery, their divine purpose, their right to claim land. In a passage that haunts the novel, Estebanico watches his master speak for him, record his story for the king, and in doing so, erase it. Even my silence was taken from me. Memory, when filtered through imperial ink, becomes mythology, and all myth is a form of violence. And then, perhaps most chilling of all stolen narrative, in these texts, the final crime is theft, not of gold, not of land, but of voice. Salih shows us how easily the post colonial subject is made into spectacle. Mustafa becomes a fable used by the narrator, by scholars, by readers, as a symbol of East meets West, of colonial guilt. But he never consents to this role. His story becomes a battleground between the living and the dead. Even his death leaves no peace. And in Lalami's novel, the act of narration is the central struggle. Estebanico's fights not just for survival but for authorship. He wants to write his own account even as he knows no one will read it, or worse, they will read it and call it fiction. This is the final horror of the colonial archive. It makes the truth unbelievable. So, where does that leave us? We, who are used to thinking of crime fiction as evidence, as logic, as pursuit of truth. Here, the truth is not something found, it is something stolen, buried, and forged anew. The archive becomes the perfect alibi. It wears the clothes of fact, the posture of objectivity, the authority of ink. But behind its pages are crimes unsolved, or even worse, crimes unacknowledged. Salih and Lalami are not just novelists, they are forensic examiners of history. They pry open these file drawers of empire and show us what bleeds. They remind us that the dead do not rest, not when their stories have been miswritten. And so we read on, not to solve, but to summon. Let me leave you then with a question, one that refuses to fade. What stories still lie buried in the archives we trust? And what would it mean to treat the footnotes as the body, the absence as the clue, the silence as the scream? This has been our descent for tonight. Until next time, remember, not all crimes leave blood on the floor. Some linger only in ink. This has been the Criminal Imagination.